Hi, I'm Colleen Pearl, and welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be all about Mercury retrograde, just in general, not in any particular sign, but how to deal with Mercury when it goes retrograde. I get this question a lot from clients. Every time they seeing Mercury retrograde in the headlines on YouTube or whatever, they panic and they always think it's going to be bad. And the truth is that nothing that the universe hands us is inherently bad. And everything that we go through in our life is there to help us learn. It's not all Saturn-based, like you must do this, very, very serious, but it's a way for the universe to offer experiences that will teach you. And that's not a very difficult way to learn, but some people are just not open to learning those lessons. So let's take a look at what Mercury retrograde really is. What does it mean when we say Mercury is in retrograde? Does it mean that the planet is moving backwards in the sky? No. No planets move backwards in the sky, including the Earth. We never move backwards. Planets continually move forward in their orbit around the sun. And that's a key concept to keep in mind, that astrology is viewed from the perspective of us on Earth. Because from our perspective on Earth, it appears that the planets are moving around us on Earth, when in actuality, they are moving around the sun. But because we have this perspective of the planets moving around us on Earth, we also get the understanding of the influence that those planets have on our lives. And of course, it's not the planets actually making us do things in our lives. It's the planets giving us really a map of what could happen in our lives at any given point. So Mercury appears to go backwards in the sky when it's what we call retrograde. The orbit of Mercury obviously goes around the sun in a very regular pattern, right? Just like the Earth goes around the sun in a very regular pattern. But sometimes Mercury gets very close to the Earth. And when it does, it distorts our perspective. It distorts our view of the orbit of Mercury. And it appears that Mercury is moving backwards. That's what Mercury retrograde is. It's the appearance of the seeming retrograde motion or backwards motion of that planet. And so because astrology is all done from the perspective of us on Earth, what we see is that Mercury seems to be not only going backwards, but changing degrees and sometimes even changing zodiac signs in this apparent backwards motion. So what we see on Earth is that before Mercury turns retrograde, and any planet, by the way, they slow down almost to a standstill. And so for a while, you will see that planet at almost the same degree for several days. Now, in the case of very large planets like Jupiter, that could be more like weeks. It's not moving very much, or seems not to move very much in our perspective. Mercury, it's just a matter of maybe a couple of days. But the speed that we perceive Mercury, that can be a couple of weeks where we see it really slowing down. Okay, so Mercury slows down, apparently, and it's coming closer to the Earth, and then apparently it just starts to move backwards. And again, it's just our perspective. When Mercury is in retrograde, in other words, when it's the closest to us on the Earth, it is also invisible. When Mercury goes retrograde, another part of the optical illusion is that it goes from being a visible planet to an invisible planet. Now, usually when a planet is invisible, not due to retrograde motion or anything like that, but let's take the case of Venus. Usually Venus is visible in the mornings or the evenings. In part of the year, it's the morning star, and in part of the year, it's the evening star. When it's visible is when it affects us the most. It's when it has the strongest impact on our lives. With Mercury and Mercury retrograde, it's the opposite. When Mercury is closest to Earth and becomes invisible in the retrograde motion, that's when it's the most impactful on our lives. Now, you could argue that it seems like it's the most impactful because Mercury retrograde wreaks havoc sometimes in our lives, and that may seem to be more impactful than when Mercury is actually working in a forward motion and working in more positive ways in our lives. So you could argue that. But nevertheless, when it's close to us is when it's going to be the strongest as far as influence goes. The other thing is that Mercury retrograde really serves a purpose. When Mercury goes retrograde, it disrupts things having to do with commerce, communication, transportation, and our daily routines. And this may be why people feel that Mercury retrograde impacts their lives so much and why so many people dread it. In reality, Mercury retrograde is affecting your left brain thinking. So anything you thought you knew, you don't know. Anything you thought you controlled, you don't control. Anything you had planned, you don't really have it planned. So this is Mercury's way of getting you to pay attention to those things. Mercury retrograde is traditionally a time to hold off on new things, especially signing new documents, selling or buying things, and in general, trying to get a new project of any kind off the ground or to make changes of any kind. Not a good time to do that. It is a good time to reflect and review what's going on in your life. During Mercury retrograde, things like facts may be hidden and unavailable. And this may not be because somebody is trying to sabotage you. This may be because your perception may be off. You may not be reading things clearly. You may look at actual words on a paper and not really read them correctly. You may hear conversations with people and only hear certain things, not really hearing the whole conversation, because you'll have people come back to you in your life and say, I told you about that, and you will not recall the conversation. That's probably a Mercury retrograde kind of phenomenon. Also, you may go ahead and sign a document during Mercury retrograde, or you may take a job, or you may negotiate something during Mercury retrograde, only coming to find that at the end of Mercury retrograde, you have changed your mind. You really wish you hadn't signed that document, or you really wish you hadn't sold or bought that new piece of equipment, and you don't agree with the negotiations that you went for during Mercury retrograde. Another fallout of Mercury retrograde might be that things just take a long time. I once tried to buy a car for my daughter during a Mercury retrograde. I was buying the car from my friend. We did the deal. We shook hands. I gave her the money for the car, and I received the title for the car. All I had to do was fill out my portion on the back of the title and take it to motor vehicles, and then my daughter would have it all registered and the car would be hers. Well, I made a mistake when I was filling out the information on the title of the car. My girlfriend was from Louisiana, New Orleans specifically. And I thought, oh, oops, I can't just cross it out, because you can't do that on car titles when you're taking ownership. You know, it's got to be perfect. So I had to obtain a new title. So I had to write to them, and it took 6 months for that title to come to us. Now, if that had happened in almost any other state, it probably would have been at the most 2 weeks, but this took 6 months. That was my fault. for trying to do that transaction during Mercury retrograde. So be forewarned. I know what I speak of. It does mess things up, and it causes mistakes, and it causes changes to things that you cannot anticipate. Mercury is linked to Hermes, the messenger of the gods. And whenever Mercury is moving backwards, messages can get a little tricky. Mercury is the ultimate trickster planet, so things can get befuddled during Mercury retrograde. This is another reason why it's usually advised to take things very slow. Don't start new things, maybe review things, analyze things, refresh things. And Mercury traditionally is associated with business and daily routines. So this is where you're going to find that meetings that were scheduled have to be rescheduled. Communications that you thought were just great have to be redone. Messages, which is communications, transportation, daily routines, commerce, which is business, all of these things can get affected by Mercury retrograde. Now, this doesn't mean that you hide under a rock. It means that you look at the things that do work in Mercury retrograde and you attend to them during the 3-week period of Mercury retrograde. During the 3 weeks of Mercury retrograde, it is well advised to slow down, take things much slower than normal, and check and double check everything that you're putting out. Also, it only lasts 3 weeks. It's not like your whole life has to come to an end. And during those 3 weeks, expect that there's going to be a few hiccups, expect that schedules are going to change, expect that people are going to misunderstand, expect that you are going to misunderstand, and roll with it. Also, don't fight the Mercury retrograde energy. This is the time to use your right brain creativity to get around Mercury retrograde. Meditate. Ask your higher self what it is that you should be focusing on. Just the act of doing the meditation and getting in touch with more creativity, more visualization is an excellent use of the Mercury retrograde energy. Reflect on your plans, reflect on projects, reflect on your business, your life, and just think a little bit quietly and alone, because Mercury retrograde is a time to be intensely reflective and contemplative. Do not try to do this in a group. That isn't what this is about. This is about quiet reflection, listening to that inner voice, and reviewing, analyzing, repairing, reworking things that you have started in the past, but maybe not finished. That is also an excellent use of Mercury retrograde energy. Also during Mercury retrograde, don't assume that you know what is going on. Like I said, you are going to be missing messages. You're going to be hearing conversations incorrectly. Other people are going to be hearing your conversation incorrectly. So don't assume that you know what's happening for everybody else, including yourself. In this way, allow yourself to free your mind of the paradigms of this is the way it always happens, so it's going to happen this way now. Let that go and realize that this is the time for right brain thinking. This is the time for being creative. But again, you need to get in touch with that inner voice. That's the most important thing. Use your left brain during Mercury retrograde for what it's meant to do: research, math, logical thinking. But do those by yourself. If you do those kinds of things, which is basically analysis, right? If you do that during Mercury retrograde, then when you come out of the Mercury retrograde, you will be able to see what the real picture is. It will be much clearer for you. The most frustrating part of Mercury retrograde is the start and the very end. And this is when Mercury is in station. So let's explain what that really is. Before any planet goes retrograde, it slows way down and comes to a standstill on a particular degree of one of the zodiac signs. This is called station. Think of it as a train coming to the station and sitting there waiting for the passengers to get on. So it's just hanging out at this one particular degree. After that, it begins moving backwards. And it will continue to move retrograde motion backwards until a certain point, and then it again comes to a station or a standstill on a degree that is before the degree that it went retrograde in. So let's make an example so you can understand this. So let's take the sign Aries. So let's say that Mercury is going to go retrograde in Aries, and it comes slower, 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 slower until it finally comes to station at 25 degrees of Aries. All right. Takes a few days, just sits there at station for maybe 48 hours, something like that. And then it begins to actually move backwards. So when it's really standing still, that's where we start counting the Mercury retrograde. So we're going to say that Mercury has slowed down. It's been traveling through the sign of Aries, and it has slowed down until it finally stations at 25 degrees of Aries. Then we have our approximately 3 weeks of retrograde motion, and Mercury moves usually slower than normal, but it does move back through the degrees of that sign, sometimes even going back into the previous sign, depending on where it started from. So let's say an average number of degrees that Mercury moves in the retrograde motion is somewhere between 10 and 12, all right? So over the 3 weeks, Mercury is going to move backwards to 15 degrees of Aries. It's going to move 10 degrees exactly of Aries. And then it's going to station at 10 degrees of Aries, and it's going to resume forward motion. Now it's coming back through. Okay, so remember, this is 25 degrees, this is 15 degrees. This is our 3-week period of Mercury retrograde. Now, before Mercury went retrograde, it will have passed through 15 degrees of Aries, right? So here it comes down the pike, and when it hits 15 degrees of Aries, that's what we call the beginning of the shadow period. And it passes through that, and it's slow, 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 slow down to the 25, and then it begins to move retrograde motion. And it moves the retrograde motion, and it moves backwards 10 degrees to that 15 degrees of Aries, and then it stops or stands still at 15 degrees of Aries, and then it moves forward. And now it's going to travel back into the 25 degrees of Aries and beyond, right? After the forward motion, where it started off at 15 degrees now, once it hits 25 degrees Aries for the second time, that's the end of the shadow period. So the shadow period may be 10 days to 2 weeks or so before and after the actual 3-week period of Mercury retrograde. But this does not mean that the same influence of Mercury retrograde is going on during that time. Mercury retrograde is really being felt in that 3-week middle period where it goes station to station to move backwards, station to move forward again. But the shadow period may hit sensitive degrees that affect you in your own chart. And that's where you're really feeling an influence that you may feel is a Mercury retrograde influence. Pop culture has really glamorized the shadow period to make it sort of one long continuous Mercury retrograde, as if Mercury retrograde could last 8 weeks or more, right? And that is not the case. Mercury retrograde lasts about 3 weeks, period. That is what it does. When the shadow period starts beforehand, you may not feel anything at all, or it may be hitting a sensitive degree. And when the planets slow down and finally station, meaning standing still on that degree, they are there for a day at least, right? So it's really hitting that degree. And if that's a sensitive degree in your chart, you're going to feel it. But that doesn't mean that it's Mercury retrograde, and that doesn't mean that it's bad. Mercury retrograde does not mean that it's bad. It's just touching off something in your chart, because conjunctions, when it hits a point, that's called a conjunction. Conjunctions are powerful, and they do cause things to happen in your life. Now, on the tail end, when Mercury is moving over the same degree as when it started the retrograde motion, if that's a sensitive degree, and they're going to be about 10 degrees apart usually, if that's a sensitive degree, then again, you have Mercury moving over a sensitive degree. And in either scenario, whether it's the beginning degree or the ending degree, you will have had that planet, or Mercury in this case, standing still over that degree, making a conjunction which stimulates activity in your life or events in your life. So that's what makes the difference. So Mercury retrograde is not to be feared. It only lasts 3 weeks. It is something that you can use working with your left and your right brain appropriately. You're going to avoid signing documents. You're going to avoid starting a new job or taking a new job during a Mercury retrograde period. But you're going to survive, and you're going to survive better, because it's going to allow you to change the way you think about things. That's what Mercury retrograde is about, changing your own paradigms. Because the world changes, our lives change, our relationships change, our jobs change, everything changes. And Mercury retrograde allows you to embrace those changes and to benefit from them. So I hope you learned something from this video about Mercury retrograde. It was very fun to put together. I hope you enjoyed it, and you'll leave me some comments down below. And don't forget, I will be doing another Mercury retrograde video about the Mercury retrograde that's coming up. So look for that. And in the meantime, I'll see you later.